Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The big story of this week is what's happening in France. Some terror attacks, French government's response, and some statements by French President Emmanuel Macron. Now, this has divided the world essentially on Muslim, non-Muslim lines. Now, we will examine in this week's national interest many issues arising out of this and maybe break these down into 5 or 6. So to begin with, let's look at a small nationality. Now you might say that this is an issue with France. France is one of the larger European countries. France, Germany, Britain, these are among the larger European countries. Or you can say this is about the Muslim population, which is not small in the world. It's almost 2 billion. So almost 25% of all human beings in the world are Muslim. A lot of them are angry. But think of this 18-year-old who had carried out this killing of the French school teacher because he had displayed those Charlie Hebdo cartoons of the Prophet in his class while explaining freedom of expression. Now his name is, he's an 18-year-old, his name is Abdullah Abuyedovich Anzorov. Sounds Russian, he's not Russian, he's a Chechen. So to that extent Russified. Now Chechnya is a tiny republic within Russia with a checkered history. How tiny is it? While I said Muslims are almost 2 billion in the world now, almost 1/4 of the entire world, Chechnya itself has a population of just about a little over a million, 95% of which is of Muslim origin. This was kept suppressed when there was a Soviet rule, and since then there has been a religious upsurge. Also, Chechnya has since the dismantling of the Soviet Union, has had many wars. There was the first Chechnya war, which the Russians fought under Yeltsin, not too successfully, but they fought quite brutally. So at the end of that one round of the war, there was a famous story of how Dzhokhar Dudayev, a former Soviet Air Force general and a veteran of Afghan war, who was now the elected president, he was assassinated by the Russian intelligence using a combination of a booby-trapped bomb and a missile riding on the waves of the satellite phone he was using. In fact, if you've been watching this tele-serial called Family Man, there is a reference to the Dudayev killing in that tele-serial. Now, after that, that place remained quite confused, and then jihadis from around the world began to congregate there because a lot of these jihadis, they were fighting in Afghanistan against the Russians. Now they were unemployed. They didn't do anything else to do besides fighting a jihad. So they landed up in Chechnya because again they were Russians to fight and kill. Now to cut the long story short, when Russians got strength again, Putin came in, there was another war, and then they crushed the Chechnyan resistance. And since then, Chechnya has been in control of the Russian authorities. What happened in the process is that while Chechnya had a small population of just over a million, half of that population by this time was reduced to refugee camps because that region was devastated. A lot of those refugees then went to European democracies. So this is the irony and this is the nub of the problem. Now this young fellow, Anzorov, Abdullah Anzorov, who carried out this killing, he was 18. He was the child of one of these refugee families. So it is not just an irony. This is how the political pictures on global Islam now pans out. So we use this example to tell you some peculiar elements about global political Islam. So first of all religions are political. All religions have politics. But at various junctures of time, some are more politicized than the rest. You can always say that there was the history of the Crusades when Christianity was as politicized as Islam. That is no longer the case, although it's nobody's case that Christianity is totally apolitical. But Islam has a continuing thread of politics which carries on through history. And some of that comes from the concept of what is called as Ummah, which is that Muslims are one pan-national nationality or pan-national entity across the world. So that's why what happens in Chechnya upsets a Muslim so much that he gets so angry that even while he takes refuge in secular France, he cannot tolerate what he sees as insult to his prophet and goes and kills a Frenchman for it. Now, when that happens, Chechen, from a country of just over 1 million Muslims, kills a French school teacher. Protests start in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. You've seen them in Bhopal and Mumbai. You've also seen angry statements from Erdogan and Imran Khan, two large Muslim countries, which are where their nationalities are not involved in this. So this is what we mean by pan-Islamism, and this is what we mean by the concept of Ummah. So we list 5 peculiar features here for you. Number 1, Muslims are the second largest religious group in the world after Christians. So Muslims are about 2 billion, Christians would be about 2.4 billion. These are not precise counted to the last decimal point, but thereabouts. Both are scattered across the world. Both do not have major countries, too many major countries where they are in a majority. But there is a basic difference. Wherever the Muslims are in a majority, barring countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and I will come to that in a bit more detail, Indonesia, these are large populations. They have different degrees of democracy. If I have to rank them in A, B, C, A being the best, then I'd say Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So they have some kind of democracy. But generally, in Muslim majority countries, you do not have democracies. Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Egypt, such as that democracy is, it's very problematic. Syria, a lot of the countries in Africa, a lot of the Muslim population actually is in Africa. If you look at all that, in fact, if you look at, I will count for you countries with large Muslim populations and see how many have democracy of any credible kind. Afghanistan, 4 crore, Algeria, 4 crore, Angola, 3 crores, Bangladesh, 15.5 or about 16 crores, Egypt, 9 crores, Indonesia, 23 crore democracy, India, 20 crores, but Muslims are not a majority. Democracy, but Muslims are not in a majority. They have many grievances, but they live in a democracy. Malaysia, 1.65 crore only. They are not even such an overwhelming majority, but they are a majority. They have some kind of a democracy, but what kind you see from Mahathir's statements, and Mahathir was until recently the leader and may well be back in leadership again. Pakistan, 22, 23 crores, you can figure out what kind of democracy. Turkey, 7.5 crores, used to be a democracy until Erdogan began reversing it using religion. Then Iraq, 4 crores, Iran, 8.25 crores. These are the large Muslim populations. In fact, if you look at the Muslim population of about 2 billion in the world, about 120, 130 crore of that, about 120 will be in all of Asia. And once again, you can count, and then in Africa, how many countries are democratic. So you have this, because of this, you have this peculiar situation that where Muslims are in a majority, and this is a factual statement, I say it without a value judgment. Where Muslims are in a majority, usually either you don't find democracy there, or if you find democracy, usually, not always, there are some honorable exceptions. Indonesia is a good exception, where they still have some democracy, say Pakistan, large Muslim population. Bangladesh again has to be spoken of with qualification because Bangladesh has moved closer to secularism. But generally, you do not have a secular commitment. Now, the flag of Pakistan has a white stripe representing Pakistan's minorities, but you know, it's not as if minorities in Pakistan have the best possible time. And if you have any doubts, don't ask the Hindus and Sikhs, ask the Ahmadiyas, who are actually Muslims but who've been constitutionally declared to be guilty of apostasy in Pakistan. So you can have some democracy, but secular commitment generally is lacking. At the same time, in the countries where Muslims have large populations and which have secularism, that secularism is then held to the test of coming up to the expectation of those Muslim populations, as in France. And if it does not come up to the expectation of those Muslim populations, then Muslims outside in faraway countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc., Turkey, they start protesting. Why? Because then they see the entire Muslim community as one. So this is the one key feature that we have to keep in mind. The second feature is that because these are populations following one faith but in many countries, in some in majority, some in not in majority, in some following one sect, 85% of Muslims are Sunni, but about 15%, 10 to 15% are Shia. And there are Shia majority countries beginning with Iran. So that leads to divisions. So confusion arises between national loyalties and pan-Islamic, pan-national loyalties. And that is a continuing confusion. And you will find very often that when the adversary is another Islamic country, then nationalism takes precedence, as in the long Iran-Iraq war, or what's happening now in Libya or Syria, places like that, or with the whole ISIS thing. But when the adversary is a non-Islamic country or a non-Muslim majority democracy, then pan-Islamism takes precedence. So this is a contradiction which continues with global Islam. In India, we've seen this with Khilafat movement or Caliphate movement, which was called Khilafat between 1919 and 1924. Generally, that is when the Ottoman Empire was being dismantled in Turkey after the First World War, and Ataturk was creating a Turkish Republic and demolishing and burying the Caliphate there. The Caliphate to which notionally Sunni Muslims across the world owed allegiance and took their wisdom and orders or spiritual guidance from. So there was a big protest in India, in many parts of the world, including in India. That was a big pan-Islamic expression. But after that, you find that it's rare that when a fighting starts or when a war starts, even between a Muslim state and a non-Muslim state, that Muslim states all come together on that, under that pan-Islamic banner. In fact, the last time in my recollection, the last time it happened properly and in a large enough manner was during the Six-Day War in 1967 against Israel. In 1973, Yom Kippur War, some of it happened, but not fully. And after that, very little of this has happened. Even Pakistan's wars with India, for example, Pakistan claimed to be, may claim to be a great supporter of Ummah, as it now shows in Imran Khan's letters and statements. But the fact is, no country from the Ummah came to Pakistan's aid in any of those wars. Yes, Jordan transferred some F-104s in 1971. Iran, I think under the Shah, gave them some sanctuaries for their fighter planes to hide during the 71 war. But beyond that, did very little for them. So this is the confusion and this is the set of contradictions that drive this process. The next contradiction is that there is a complete mismatch between the concentration of Muslim populations or the numbers of people and the size of the GDP. So the wealth and the population are separated. So the wealth of the Muslim world lies essentially among the Gulf Arab countries. Gulf Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, etc., Kuwait, they have very small populations. Whereas Muslim countries with large Muslim populations, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, even India, not majority but a large population, India actually has the largest Muslim population for a non-Islamic country, non-Muslim majority country. In all these countries are much poorer compared to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, etc. So the money is there, the people are here, religion is one. Now, does that spirit of pan-Islamism mean that these rich countries distribute their riches to their poorer Muslim brethren elsewhere? They don't do that. So what happens is that the Western world has found it easy to keep these countries and their rulers under their, I won't say control, but as their allies within their sphere. To that extent, these large Muslim populations in poorer countries and poor populations feel even more alienated. And that applies to African Muslim populations also, particularly those African nations which were earlier colonies of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Britain. And that's why you find a lot of these refugees or migrants, they are not all refugees, from these former colonies in these European countries, their former colonial rulers, not at ease with themselves and trying to find their raison d'etre in life, I'm sorry to use such bad French, elsewhere. And that's why you see this phenomenon like the Francophone Africans from former French colonies and a Chechnyan now all getting involved in angry actions in Europe and elsewhere. Now, the fourth factor is that in most of these richer countries, richer Muslim countries, no dissent is allowed. In fact, now no dissent is allowed even in Turkey, which used to be democracy. How much dissent is allowed in Pakistan? We know so many of Pakistan's dissenters are today exiled. So many are in jail. The owner of Pakistan's largest media group, Mir Shakilur Rahman, has been in jail forever now, it seems, for trumped up charges. So, because you are not allowed, your democratic impulse is kept subdued, not just subdued, but crushed in these countries. Then you try and seek revenge elsewhere. That is what I mean when I say globalization of revenge. And I wrote an article long ago, of which I am sharing a copy, a link with you, my old national interest from almost 15-17 years ago, which talked about globalization of revenge. And that was written inspired by the 9/11 attacks. That you have these people in Saudi Arabia, other Arab countries, they are furious with their regimes. They think their regimes are dictatorial, they are corrupt, they are stooges of the West. But they cannot speak. They cannot write an article, they cannot raise a slogan, they cannot carry a placard, they cannot put out a tweet, they cannot write a blog, they can't even write a letter to the editor. Because if they do, they could spend the rest of their lives in jail or be discovered with a bullet in their head in some funny place. So what do? They can't protest there, so they protest in democracies where they can protest. So they protest in Europe, they protest in America, and as we see now, following this, what's happened in France, you can protest in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. But you can't protest in Saudi Arabia. You can't protest in Kuwait, UAE, because UAE might have a majority of its population from South Asia, that is India, Bangladesh. But if they carry out one protest there, all of them will be either sent to jail for a long time or put on the next plane and sent back to their respective countries. So nobody does any such thing because you don't have the right to protest. So then you globalize your protest. You protest where you can. And similarly, because these are national security states with very tough intelligence and very unforgiving military-like systems, you cannot even carry out a revenge attack there. So you go elsewhere and carry out revenge. That's why you go to New York and bring down the Twin Towers, because that's a country that is so open that you can go there, you can get visas, you can transfer money there, or you can train to become airline pilots, and then you can hijack planes and slam them into two buildings. That is globalization of revenge. So globalization of protest, globalization of revenge, then this kind of vicarious use of democracy, because you are angry, you take out your anger in a democracy while you might be angry over something that's happening, elsewhere, just as this Chechen boy has done. Now, these are the contradiction, and then there is a fifth one. The fifth one is that behind all this, if you look at the history of past 40 years or so, I'm going a decade before the Cold War ended. If you look at that history, or beginning with the Iran-Iraq war, or maybe beginning with Yom Kippur war between Israel and the rest. After that, Israel and Egypt made peace, and Israel and Jordan made peace. But if you go through that period, most wars have taken place in the Islamic world between Muslims and Muslims. So even the wars that took place in Iraq, where the Americans went in twice, they had many major Muslim powers by their side. In fact, in 1991, the first Gulf War, I flew in a Saudi Air Force C-130 from Dhahran to Kuwait on the day of the liberation. The entire crew of that Saudi Air Force C-130 was Pakistani. And similarly, in the next war also, very many Islamic states were partners with America, as in Afghanistan. So in fact, the one time you see a lot of the Islamic countries coming together towards a pan-Islamic cause genuinely was in the first jihad in Afghanistan. And who put that together? Who put that alliance together? It's the Americans who put that alliance together. But once again, that was a story essentially of Muslims killing Muslims. So you have this total mess now. ISIS is Muslims killing Muslims. Too many states, Islamic states that are settled, which have stable regimes, do not like ISIS because it threatens them. Why does the ISIS threaten them? Because ISIS essentially is telling them exactly what they are telling the rest of the world. ISIS is saying all of the Muslims are one nation. We are pan-national. All of the Muslims have to have a caliphate. If you have to have a caliphate, we are the caliphate. And what kind of a caliphate is it if you don't follow the Sharia and proper Muslim way of life as we see it? So these are issues that Muslim intellectuals, Muslim thinkers, etc. have to figure out amongst themselves. And it's because of how these issues weaken the Muslim power. Muslims should have a lot of power in this world, but it weakens Muslim power to such an extent that even today they can question Emmanuel Macron in France for what is happening there. They can question any other leader in the democratic world. They can question Narendra Modi if they wish to. But the one leader they cannot question is, or the one country or regime they cannot question is, the one that's carrying out, and it's all documented, the most serious and egregious excesses and atrocities in Muslim people. I'm talking about the Chinese and the Uyghurs. If Pan-Islamism was genuinely a strong entity, they would have had the ability to speak up about that. But they don't do that. They can only do it, remember, about democracies.